Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Gibson. I'm the executive editor and the foreign editor at The New Statesman. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today, online and here at ODI, to today's panel discussion, reflecting on the conflict in Ukraine and the arrival of Ukrainian refugees across Europe and how that has impacted broader attitudes, narratives, and policies towards refugees across the continent. And before we dive in, I just want to flag that for those of us who are joining us online, who would like an English to Polish translation, there should be a prompt button, a little globe icon on your screen that you can click now. So 1 year on from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, almost 5 million refugees have been registered for protection across Europe. For the most part, Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed from public and politicians alike. We've seen European leaders very quick to implement inclusive policies to welcome Ukrainians and make policy interventions that were very, very positive and welcoming. As we all know, this has marked a departure from ongoing discussions and attitudes about refugees and asylum across Europe, which have been marked by a different tenor. So this raises a number of questions. One, how has the arrival of Ukrainian refugees impacted the political and public narratives around refugees in Europe? What impact has there been on the broader willingness to accept refugees? Has the arrival of Ukrainian refugees impacted wider policies and efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to other groups? And what opportunities exist to harness those positive narratives and opinions towards Ukrainians in order to influence broader narratives about refugees and asylum seekers in Europe? So to address those questions, I'm delighted to welcome a panel of experts focused on Poland, the UK, and Europe more broadly. I'm going to start first with introducing Karen Hargrave, who's joining us remotely. She's an independent consultant and research associate at ODI, focusing on migration and displacement. Karen's work covers a number of themes, including public attitudes towards refugees and migrants in Europe and across Africa. Today, Karen will speak about trends in Poland, drawing on research with ODI, looking at public narratives and attitudes in the country towards refugees and other migrants. Also focusing on Poland and also joining us remotely is Kamila Fiałkowska, a researcher at the University of Warsaw's Center for Migration Research. Since the beginning of the crisis of the Polish-Belarus border, she's been involved in the work of the research collective Researchers on the Border. Kamila will speak specifically about how the situation there and policy responses have developed since the arrival of refugees from Ukraine. And then joining us here today in London, we turn to Sunder Katwala, who will reflect on the situation in the UK and the trends in public and attitudes and narratives here. As you know, everyone here, it's quite a hot political moment to be having this discussion in the UK. So Sunder is the director of the British Future, an independent, non-partisan UK think tank and registered charity, which engages people's hopes and fears about integration, immigration, identity, and race. He's previously worked as a journalist and in a range of other roles from Fabian Society to Macmillan. And finally, also joining us here is Lenka Dražanová, who will speak to public attitudes across Europe. Lenka is a research fellow at the European University Institute's Migration Policy Center in Florence, where she is part of the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration project. Her research focuses on political behavior, public opinion, and individual attitude formation, and the conditions under which these attitudes emerge. Now, there'll be time today during the event for Q&A with the panel. We will take questions here in the room, but also from online. So if you're joining us online, please do enter your questions in the chat at any point, along with your name, organization, and the country from which you're residing in, and our team will pass them up to me here, and we can put them to the panel. And we also encourage you to tweet about the event. Social media, you can use the hashtag refugee narratives, and you can tag ODI at ODI_global on Twitter. So I'm going to dive in. Karen, I'm going to go to you first. Based on your research with ODI, how has the arrival of Ukrainian refugees impacted the public and political narratives around refugees within Poland? And what has the impact been in terms of broader willingness to accept refugees?
Thanks, Megan. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you to join you in person today. I'm just going to bring up some slides, if you bear with me a moment. Okay, so I'm going to be just sharing some reflections today, really based on recent research with ODI, looking at public narratives and attitudes towards refugees and other migrants in Poland. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on the methodology for the sake of time, but very briefly, our research drew on a review of the literature and survey data, as well as a review of Polish language media sources and a number of key informant interviews. And it's important to say that the research also built on a lot of work that has already been done on this within Poland. So I just want to say a very big thank you to the many academics and other stakeholders in Poland who were so generous with their time and insights as we were undertaking the research, hopefully some of whom will be joining in the online audience today. So I want to take you back to February the 24th last year, when it became clear almost immediately, really, that vast numbers of refugees from Ukraine were headed to Poland. And in the months that followed, there was a lot of commentary, both from outside, but also within Poland, pointing to an emerging double standard in terms of the welcoming policies, attitudes, and narratives regarding Ukrainian refugees on the one hand, and those around other groups of refugees on the other hand. And to start with Ukrainians, today UNHCR estimates that over 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine have been registered for protection in Poland, though not all remain in the country today. And Ukrainians who fled to Poland last year joined many others who migrated following Russia's more limited invasion in 2014, who largely arrived through temporary labour migration pathways. And Ukrainian immigration to Poland post-2014 was effectively the first mass immigration in Poland's modern history. So it's estimated that before the recent escalation of conflict, around 1.3 million Ukrainians had already entered Poland. And on the eve of the Russian invasion last February, Polish attitudes towards Ukrainians were not necessarily effusive, but they leaned positive. But then as refugees from the conflict began to arrive, there was this huge outpouring of support. So we saw positive narratives across all levels of government, making very clear that Ukrainians would be welcomed in Poland. And this was pretty much echoed across all parts of Polish society, who very, very quickly, as we saw, mobilized to provide support. So in March last year, CBOS, who are a Polish Public Opinion Polling Institute, found that an overwhelming 94% of Poles supported accepting Ukrainian refugees. And that figure dropped a little bit in the months that followed, but from around June last year, it stabilized at around 80% who are supportive of accepting Ukrainians. So, of course, there's no room for complacency about these attitudes. And of course, there are concerns among some Poles about the impacts of hosting Ukrainians in the longer term, particularly in the context of high attention to inflation and the rising cost of living. But so far, at least, positive attitudes and narratives remain relatively resilient. And I think to fully appreciate the contrast with other groups, we really need to go back to a key turning point in 2015. So in the early 2000s, attitudes towards immigration and refugees in Poland were actually among the most positive in Europe. And before 2015, public debate on immigration was virtually non-existent, which is pretty unsurprising in the context then of relatively low immigration levels. But in 2015, immigration and refugees specifically shot up the political and media agenda. And that wasn't due to new refugee arrivals in Poland or even due to the mass immigration of Ukrainians around that time, but due to the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, which very quickly became the centerpiece of the Law and Justice Party's successful 2015 parliamentary election campaign. And a very distinctive set of narratives emerged during this time that were echoed in mainstream and particularly in right-leaning media outlets. And you can see some examples there on the slide. And mirroring narratives elsewhere in Europe and further afield, these narratives effectively characterize refugees from the Middle East and Africa, and particularly Muslim refugees, as a threat to Poland's culture, health, and security. And this was framed very effectively by the Law and Justice Party as a story of us versus them. So an us that is deserving of security and the freedom to choose who to welcome, in opposition to a them made up of threatening refugee others and European elites who are cast as trying to enforce their will on Poland. And there's a lot more that can be said there, and we do go into much more detail in the full report. But what was particularly stark was the way in which these negative narratives in 2015 correlated with a shift in public opinion. So the graph here shows data from CELOS again, tracking public opinion towards refugees throughout 2015 and into 2016. There's quite a lot going on here, but if you just look at the light blue line here, you can see how opposition to accepting refugees from countries affected by conflict jumps up from about 20% in May 2015 to over 60% by April 2016, a year later. And after that point, attitudes slowly grew more positive again. But what really endured was the way in which these narratives around refugees went on to shape the parameters of public debate. And they became particularly prominent again in 2021 in the context of arrivals from the Middle East and Africa to the Poland-Belarus border, which I know Kamila will be speaking to in much more detail in a moment. But very briefly on that, in terms of narratives, the situation there is in many ways a lot more complex than in 2015. But what was very notable was a very hardline policy stance from Poland's central government and highly securitized narratives that painted arrivals as a hybrid threat to Poland at the hands of Belarus. So in this context, it's really not very surprising that many pointed to a sharp difference just months later when Ukrainian refugees began arriving in Poland. And in terms of narratives from Poland's central government around other groups, not really much changed with the arrival of Ukrainians. And if anything, as Ukrainian refugees began arriving in Poland, they were used as a rhetorical device to highlight a perceived contrast between Ukrainians as the archetypal good or genuine refugee and other groups of refugees arriving in Poland who are cast as economic migrants abusing Poland's hospitality. There's a good example here taken from a report from the Center of Migration Research in Warsaw. So you can see a meme here that was tweeted out by Poland's Territorial Defense Force on February the 27th last year, just days after the Russian invasion, with the caption, which roughly translates as, "What's the difference between a refugee and a migrant? A picture says about 1,000 words." And the demographics of Ukrainian refugees here, who have predominantly been women, children, and the elderly, are used here really to reinforce this contrast, so playing on stereotypes of vulnerability in comparison to an image of a mass of supposedly threatening young male arrivals from elsewhere. And what was particularly interesting is that as Ukrainians arrived, once again, we saw a story of us and them emerging in Poland, but this time with a difference in that Ukrainians were not painted as a threatening other, but really as part of an us, standing together with Poles against Russian forces that really have for centuries posed a threat to Poland's own identity and existence. So I'm just going to speak also very briefly on public opinion. I know that Lenka is going to share some of MPC's new data looking at this question across Europe, so I don't want to preempt that. But what we did look at in our research were some data points from long-standing surveys in Poland that look at attitudes to immigration and refugees, where part or all of the fieldwork last year was undertaken after refugees arrived from Ukraine. And what's interesting is that several of these data points actually show record high levels of positivity. So for example, last year, the European Social Survey found that just under half of Poles felt that immigration made Poland a better place to live, which was the highest proportion recorded in any round of the survey. You can see another example here from Ipsos's annual World Refugee Day poll. So in this figure, you can see responses to the question of closing Poland's borders entirely to refugees. And if you look just at the proportion of those opposed to closing the country's borders, so the dark blue line on the slide, you see a big jump up last year following the arrival of Ukrainians, with 3/4 of Poles opposed to closing the country's border. And on the face of it, this looks very much like Poles becoming much more accepting towards refugees on the whole following the arrival of Ukrainians. But I think it's important to say that it's effectively impossible here to disentangle whether this genuinely reflects a shift in attitudes towards other groups as well, or if it just reflects that Poles have become increasingly likely to associate the term refugee with Ukrainians towards whom they're overwhelmingly supportive. So it doesn't mean that there hasn't been any wider change in attitudes, and we do actually know that attitudes were already warming, as you can see here, before last year. But I think we do need to just be a little bit careful here, not to overinterpret this upswing in positive opinion, and certainly something to keep tracking over time. So finally, I just wanted to close with a few words looking to the future. So in terms of narratives, I think on the one hand, it wouldn't be a surprise, and it's certainly something we've seen from Poland's government in the past, to see the large number of refugees from Ukraine now hosted in Poland being used to justify a more closed approach to other groups. So essentially putting forward the argument that when it comes to refugees, Poland has more than done its part. And I think if there is going to be a reset in narratives in Poland, I think it would really need to be from the ground up. And I think that's where we can look to opportunities for actors who have for years really been trying to put forward more positive narratives around other groups. And I think the most important point there is we can look to how Poles really from all walks of life mobilized to help Ukrainian refugees, and how that reflects really a very clear vision of a compassionate, welcoming Poland. And while, for example, attitudes are likely to be more mixed on the situation on the Poland-Belarus border, there is some data to suggest that many Poles are not necessarily enthusiastically behind some of the most hardline elements of the government's approach. So there may be some space for alternative narratives to find traction if framed carefully, and perhaps that's something I can speak to more later. So I'll finish there on that slightly more optimistic note. As I mentioned, there's much more detail in our full report, but I'll finish there for the sake of time, and plenty that I can come back to in the Q&A, but I'll pass back to you, Megan, in London there.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And to build on some of the points you touched on there, we're going to go to Kamila now. Kamila, drawing on your work on the Poland-Belarus border, how has the arrival of Ukrainian refugees impacted the wider policy landscape within Poland and efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to other groups?
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I also will show a few slides in my attempt to answer that question and give you a little bit of also background to whatever is happening on the Belarusian border. Do you see the slides now? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So one thing is important to keep talking about the Polish-Belarusian border, because what we've seen since last year, February last year, is the focus shifted almost entirely to what is happening in Ukraine and arrival of refugees from Ukraine, while not much changed on the Polish-Belarusian side. So we also need to highlight that that it is still all quiet at the EU eastern border, the border with Belarus. And just a second. And yes, thank you, Karen, for bringing up this so-called refugee crisis and the reception in Poland. I just want to very briefly mention also on that. Obviously, as you know, there was no to relocation of refugees, and there was a parliamentary election when the refugee issue was politicized, mobilized, and used as a used in the campaign by minor and very major political figures. Here on the poster, you see one of the very minor political figures that didn't enter the parliament, but also used this Islamization threat in his campaign. One of his no's in the top left is no to Islamization of Poland, as it is as if this was some sort of serious threat that we are facing. So just to give you a situation, give you the background of the situation, that it wasn't. The situation was changing very quickly towards very negative stance towards refugees reception, especially coming from the south, from Middle East. And another thing that is important to mention is that the situation was evolving, and already in 2016-18 on the Belarusian border, we have witnessed first documented pushbacks on the Brest-Tiraspol border crossing. That's been also quite well documented by the activists and researchers. And you can also check out the reports of Helsinki Foundation on this particular issue. These were people mostly coming from Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, who were trying to cross the border, who were repetitively stopped, sent back by train back to Brest, and they had several attempts of crossing the border, and some of them managed successfully to file their asylum application. And what we have since August 2021, this is so-called humanitarian crisis. It is not a refugee crisis. And it's a humanitarian crisis mainly because of the response of the government that is weaponizing on migrants and militarized the border area, which effectively ended up in a humanitarian crisis. That means also attempts in legalizing illegality, introducing state of emergency, so-called no-go zone, or later on, until the end of June 2022, when the construction of the border fence was accomplished, and that supposedly should, in the discourse that is created by the government, the mainstream political party, and media, should stop the crisis, although it obviously did not stop anything. There's been also amendments to the national law that would attempt to legalize pushbacks. There's more on it in the reports of the border group, and also organizations that are working on these issues, like Helsinki Foundation and Association for Legal Intervention. You can all check this also and get some details. And there's been also several attempts to criminalize the aid activities that are happening on the border, because there's been mobilization of civil society organizations, human rights defenders, to actually provide humanitarian aid to people who are crossing the border. And on the picture, you see how it looks like in the forest of Białowieża, how people are trying to cross the border, how they are assisted also by the activists. There are some things left in the forest after signifying their presence, and there's many encampments like this in the Białowieża forest still today. This is very brief overlook on the situation as it started in Poland in August 2021, and it's still ongoing. I mentioned the state of emergency and the no-go zone. This is the very sketchy map that shows you how it looks like. So it was a territory of the nearing the border from between 2 to sometimes 12 kilometers from the borderline, that you have restricted access if you were not inhabitant of this local area or you did not work there. So media, aid organizations, international aid organizations were not allowed to enter this area. So that also means that there was very little access of the public and very little knowledge of the public of what is happening on the border. These are some visual representations of how it looks like in the borderland area, nearing this no-go zone or no entry zone. And I just want to very quickly go through those pictures, because these are the representations of dissent of the local population activists on my left side. So one is coming from the local activists. It is their initiative to kind of talk about this issue and visualize it also in the public spaces locally. And it says here, what you've done to one of us, to one of my brothers, you've done to me. It's a biblical quote. It was put in on the signs in the public nearing the Easter time last year, in order to kind of bring this issue to the fore and discuss it also, and also a protest against the construction of the wall in one of the local towns. On the right, there is this representation of the public government discourse that shows the unilateral support for whatever the government is doing, the support for the army's presence, the support for the border guards in their defense of the border. And it's very interesting because the bottom right picture shows the sign that is on the fence of the local mosque in one of the villages that small Tatar Muslim minorities living. And it is also the cemetery of the mosque is the burial place of few victims, a few people who died on the border. So it's we see tension there. So there's like people who actually are showing the support of, like, ostentatiously showing the support for the government policies, but yet at the same time these are the Muslim community. So there is a clear tension here also. And in the middle there's a picture from local shop in the border area that collects stuff, donations for the arriving Ukrainian refugees, and that was open in the public and for everyone to chip in something. So there's been a lot of conflicting information and also visible in the local areas. And there's many more, but obviously we cannot spend the whole time talking about it, but it's a fascinating topic also. And we've been, since spring last year, we've been collecting information from the local activists and inhabitants of their activities and their interactions with the services, with the border guards, with the police, with the army, while they were attempting to provide humanitarian aid. And it's very difficult to provide humanitarian aid in the situation of militarization and of attempts of criminalizing this aid. Attempts to put charges on people for human smuggling, for instance, and some of these interactions are particularly telling because, in my opinion, they legitimize the racial hierarchies at the border. So my own field note is from our interaction with the police when we were driving in the borderland area. We were stopped by the police. The police didn't check our documents, but the comment was as it reads, "All of you Polish here, because if not, then we would have to check." And obviously we looked Polish because we were all white women in the car. The other one is from one of the activists, very active, very experienced also, and he was also checked by the police, who briefly looked at the faces of the people in the car and commented like, "Thank you, I see that everyone looks fine." And that means everyone is white, because it's not an innocent comment in that particular border area. The other thing also from the activists, the other one, that I managed to talk to, it was post-intervention. They were returning from the intervention. They were stopped by the territorial defense units, and from the distance they shouted at them, "Stop, stop, come here, say something in Polish." So that's also a clear sign of how ethnic, national, racial profiling is happening on the borderland area. But this spectacle of racialized border violence doesn't happen only at the border area, but also in other spaces. So here I want to give you an example of how the authorities here, the border guards, try to put forward their narrative about who is the legitimate right refugee and who is a bogus refugee. And here it is an example from the lecture that commandant of the Podlaski Border Guard Unit gave at the University of Białystok at the opening of the academic year, when he says a lot of stuff, but few particularly interesting and troubling were referring to who is actually the refugees. So refugees are people who are reaching the neighboring country, first safe country on their way. And here he gives an example of Ukraine and Poland, especially, but then also a neighboring Syria and Turkey, or Somalia and Kenya. But generally, he stresses that refugees are reaching the first safe territory, which is obviously not true. It doesn't reflect the reality either in law or from empirical research. And this is the border guard speaking. So supposedly the people who actually should know the law and should not put forward the message that is not true according to the law, and it's actually simplifying the situation. And so going to the, I have the same picture as Karen here. Moving forward to the arrival of the Ukrainian refugees, we also know that it's not exactly a rosy picture, because we've seen and witnessed a lot of problems with reception of international students fleeing Ukraine, especially students coming from African countries or Indian subcontinent. There's been also a lot of instances of documented discrimination and prejudice against the Ukrainian Roma. Our colleagues who were documenting the reception of Ukrainian Roma in one of the reception centers were told to be careful out there in the Gypsy district. So one of the part of the center was accommodating Roma refugees, and there was a clear prejudice against them. It's one of the very many examples of such prejudices and discrimination. And what it means, sorry, I want to very quickly mention a few things related to the picture on the right that already Karen said, so I will not repeat this, but it has repercussions for other asylum seekers. It is this clear preference for gender and for women, especially, and whiteness also plays an important role here. So there's this women and children as an ideal refugee, preferably white women, and preferably from neighboring country, Christian country, which is playing an important role here, I think. And it has a repercussion for other refugees, especially men, especially coming from other contexts, supposedly presenting them as a threat. And this is linked with the imagination of the masculinities, especially Muslim men, who are presented as threatening, as dangerous, as violent, and their culture, those are also presented as irreconcilable with ours. So that's why that brings some serious repercussions for reception of other refugees, especially not corresponding with this ideal type. And there's been also a shift in narrative and ongoing attempts at criminalizing the help that is happening on the border. Here on the tweet on the right on the picture, you see a few activists crossing the so-called border road in attempts to deliver stuff through the fence to the people who are on the other side of the fence. And one of those person was a German activist who was effectively removed from the Polish territory with the ban to enter Poland for the next 5 years. And the tweet says, reports of the border guards shows that some EU citizens and Polish activists do not understand what we are dealing with. The actions at the border are hybrid operation in line with Russia's aggression against the West. And it's clearly one thing, it's infantilizing and ridiculing activists as those naive idealists or just idiots and traitors, as once the Polish president says about them. But also invisibilizing people on the move or treating them instrumentally when it is useful. And then it is also Russia that comes to the fore, not Belarus anymore. Russia as the arch enemy, as the main architect of the crisis. And as I started, it is all quiet the EU eastern border because whatever, like we have a lot of discussions, we have a lot of interventions. There's been also court rulings that are in favor of the activists and are violating or are clearly saying that Poland is violating the rights of refugees to apply for international protection, and it's also confirming that help is legal, that you cannot criminalize help activities on the border. Yet, despite all of this, the policy of pushbacks continues. In the December last year, Polish border guards admitted to 50,000 pushbacks, and the number is growing, it's continuing. And just a very brief, few very brief information about most recent development in this area, reported by the border group. So the crisis continues in the sense that there are still people in the forest who are asking for help. In the last 2 months, there's been more than 700 people asking for help from December to January. Almost 300 people reported more than 500 pushbacks, that included also minors. There's 317 people missing. Until today, we know of 37 deaths. There's probably more, but it's difficult because of the difficulties in accessing the territories, and also militarization of the area is difficult to actually search the area properly. There's been a reported violence from the Polish forces of beating, pepper spraying, threats, taking away property, clothes, food, and phones. And phones are essential in this context. Only in March, that comes from the border guards reports on Twitter, because they communicate very actively on Twitter. Only in this last 8 days, there's been over 500 attempts to cross the border in unauthorized spaces. Basically, that means that the crisis is ongoing. The policies are not changing, despite the court ruling that are openly saying that, okay, whatever is happening, the pushbacks are illegal and you cannot criminalize activists. It doesn't change the reality on the ground for now. So that will be it for now. So I'm happy to answer any questions if they come later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamila. That was fantastic. So now I'm just mindful of the time. I'm going to go to Sunder to look at the situation here in the UK. What trends or shifts have you seen in terms of public attitudes or narratives towards refugees since the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be at this and for the question. British Future, just for people who don't know it, non-partisan charity. We're interested in an inclusive, confident, welcoming Britain, and that means we want to engage with people who are already confident about migration, change and diversity, and with people who aren't, and to look whether there is more common ground and broader coalitions for playing our role in the world and having confidence in how we do so. And there have been really important shifts in this period, but the broad answer to the exam question we were given, will the crisis reshape the European narrative? Basically, the answer is no. It will have lots of impacts, but it won't reshape the European narrative, because we've already heard from Poland, there isn't a European narrative. There are global trends and crises. There are continent-wide events, and this war is as big as 1989 and 9/11, the continent-wide event. And then there are national discourses and national politics, and the Polish case is very exceptional, and the British case is very exceptional. And there may be some overlaps between the French and the Swedish and the Polish and Danish cases and so on, but there are national discourses, and then there are local experiences that inform or inflect the national discourse. And I think the UK is another outlier case in the way we talk about immigration. This episode this year has been part of a roller coaster ride for how Britain thinks and talks about immigration and refugees. This week is part of a roller coaster ride. You've got the toughest ever legislation that, if passed, would actually more or less abolish the refugee convention just ahead of the anniversary of the Homes for Ukraine scheme, when actually more people have been involved in refugee protection in Britain than ever before. That started a few weeks before the government announced that maybe deporting people to Rwanda was its policy. So the toughest ever policies and the biggest ever welcoming initiatives going together. But that set of dichotomies is set in something else for post-Brexit Britain and how we think about it. Britain chose Brexit 52% to 48% and wouldn't have done so without a loss of public confidence in the government's handling of the scale and pace of migration, particularly economic migration by that time, including from Poland, where people were rather positive actually in Britain. Most people were rather positive about the contribution of Poles to British society, but they were rather negative about British governments and how they'd managed and handled that experience of change fairly for local place. And it wouldn't quite have been 52-48 if that hadn't happened. And then something surprising happened in the World Values Survey, as with some of the shifts in Poland. Britain is now an outrider in international comparisons for pro-migration public attitudes. It's jumped to the other end of the space, and it's very complicated as to why that's happened. There have been several different shifts. The salience is much lower, even with all the politics right now. 12% of people think immigration generally is a top priority issue, or the top 3 priority issue. That was at 40 and 50, 2014, 2016. So it's coming back, but it's coming back from having hit its lowest level. There's more confidence in the economic contribution, more confidence in the cultural contribution, a softening of attitudes to refugees in general, people fleeing war and persecution. But also the other shift is that it's much less one size fits all, because one thing that happens if you tell yourself you've got control is you need to decide what to do about it. And the question becomes less yes or no, or free movement or not. The question becomes, what's your policy for your health service workers? What's your policy for skills or students or people who pick fruit, or your refugee policies for different crises, or your asylum policy? And for the public and for the politicians, you have to make more differentiated choice. So it brings out a differentiation. Is that differentiation problematic? We've heard some examples how it might be problematic. It can be helpful, actually, to take migration out of being a yes or no question into what choices do we want to make. So different people have changed their minds for different reasons. There's a sense of catharsis. Lots of people who say, I'm not even allowed to talk about this issue. It's hard to say that at this point in time. There's a sense of control. from some people because Brexit has given you a new system. There's a sense of regret from other people who didn't want Brexit, have sort of radicalised the other way and want their country back. And there's more polarisation around the issues of asylum, partly because what there is much more consent now for managed openness. And the Ukraine refugee scheme is managed openness, and people wanted to do more. And people crossing the channel is clearly nobody's idea of a managed asylum system. They're dangerous journeys. So we've got these contradictions going on. What do we do with them, and how do we try to respond to them? If we think about the Host Ukraine scheme, which is introduced in the UK 3 weeks after the invasion, the UK is struggling to make its contribution at that point because it's post-Brexit Britain, so it's not part of just declaring that people are open and people can come. It's trying to use a visa-based scheme that is designed for study and work and so on for a war and refugees from a war. And so there's a difficult moment there. Get to the end of the story, 165,000 Ukrainians have come to Britain. So when you look at what Poland has done, which is 10 times as high, you could say, well, there is a contribution, but it's a relatively small share of the whole, and that's true. It's also, if you look at it through another lens, the biggest group of people from any one country to come to Britain as refugees for over a century, not quite the biggest number ever, because the Belgians who fled the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, 250,000 came, but it's the biggest since. And so very big and historic refugee flows to Britain that are iconic are much smaller than this one. So that's quite an interesting perspective. And that means that more people in more places chose to do it. But there's something very important in how it was done, because I think about 50,000 people came on a family scheme. At first, there was only going to be a family scheme, and another 20 or 30,000 people given the right to stay because they were here as students, temporary workers, and so on. 100,000 people came through this scheme that was uncapped, but you would come if someone asked you to come and made a match for you. And this inverts actually the anti-migration narrative of Britain's immigration discourse in the media and public for 50 years. So 50 years people have been said, we were never asked. Powell was right, nobody wanted any of this. Governments, they don't listen to any of us, they just foist immigration on an unwilling public. And what happened last March and last April is that the public foisted refugee protection on a slightly cautious and unwilling government, because you had, not just in the New Statesman and the Guardian, but in the Daily Mail and the Express, people writing letters and writing columns saying, I'm trying to get people to Britain, and the Home Office bureaucracy is getting in the way. What is going on? And so you had a complete inversion, really, of that story about the public and migration. And it was innovative because it opened up the possibility to get more space where people could be accommodated. There was a debate in civic society. I mean, two debates. One is it right to do exceptional schemes for exceptional crises? And people are nervous about having a specific scheme, but also recognised as a crisis and want there to be part of it. There was a big controversy about should people get to match themselves, and people would say, oh, this is refugee policy by Tinder. We don't want this. It's dehumanising. If you want to do refugee protection at scale, that's a really good way for it to scale. And it's actually, if you talk to people, civic society, people from Ukraine working on this here, it's got more autonomy and power because the choice is both ways, actually. But if you were not doing that, you would have a list of, in a couple of departments, you'd have a list of 100,000 people in Britain who wanted to help. You'd have a list of, if you could find them, 30, 40, 50,000, 70,000 people from Ukraine who wanted to come, and someone would have to start matching them up. And actually, it's quite a positive thing if you want at scale for people to match up, because they could make a connection or find a connection, as long as there's services for people who can't to try and put them together. So it's actually quite a positive thing to do that. And I think we should test our doubts about it. But we were able to innovate because there was extremely strong public support, political support, media support across a broad spectrum to do it. I think the debate we're having today is, when we do exceptional things, does it create higher barriers, or can we use a crisis, do something well, and broaden the circle of support? And being against anything we do in a crisis misses the point that we innovate in crises. And then the question is, can you broaden or do you sharpen when you do it? And that's particularly clear in the UK, because we've had 3 crises responses in 2 years. So when China had a crackdown in Hong Kong, one of the biggest decisions of post-Brexit Britain was to say to millions of people in Hong Kong, of course, you're welcome to post-Brexit Britain. Of course, we want a large flow of immigration, because that had something to do with us. It's not a racial synergy between Hong Kongers, East Asian Hong Kongers and British people. It's something to do with us because we were part of that deal. So 150,000 people have come in 2 years, extremely quiet, one of the largest waves in history, with unanimous political support in the House of Commons. There are different reasons. If you're a Liberal Democrat or Scottish Nationalist or a right-wing Conservative, you might think that's good. Afghanistan, we were not expecting the fall of Afghanistan, so we scrambled to have an evacuation. 20,000 people came out, and the resettlement programme has really struggled. And there was a very strong feeling among the British public that that had quite a lot to do with us. The war in Afghanistan and what happened, and specifically there was anger if people who had a connection to the British state, the British armed forces, were not, a debt of honour was not repaid. So there was general concern for, you know, women in Afghanistan or human rights ground, a specific obligation that you shouldn't let down people so you had a debt of honour. So again, the exceptionalism is doing something broadening as well as something tightening. So how do we do this now? How do we link up these crises? I think we need to invent a standing mechanism that can flex to the crises and that can be used at times when there aren't crises. We shouldn't project onto the people who've stood up to help that, you know, maybe there's something exceptional or narrow about why they helped in this crisis. This was the first time people in Britain had a chance to do something like this. I think if you go to your synagogue or your church or your mosque, you will hear about opportunities. There's been community sponsorship for Syrians, and 1,000 people came in 4 or 5 years, but you have to put a lot of work in. You have to know quite a lot about it. When the call went out, there was just, you know, it was never marketed because you know, well over 100,000 people stepped forward, you know, in the first days. So making that offer there, making it possible to do something for contact and welcoming with groups if you haven't got a spare room, there's a real opportunity to build that. And the reason we should really lean into this moment, I think, is that if you wanted to broaden the confidence, whether in Britain or any other country, of refugee support, which is generally warming, but very polarised and very choppy, you want to broaden the political, social, and especially the geographical basis of support, because we've got very, very strong support for migration and refugees in highly diverse big cities among younger people, but the politics of that doesn't get you, you know, what you want in a parliament. If you have people stepping up in Birmingham, Manchester, and London, and in Cornwall and Norfolk and Cumbria to do their bit in their place because they decide to do it, it has a potential to transform the medium term and the longer term attitudes. One piece of evidence that More in Common are doing some research about this, people who would like to host again, 7 out of 10 of them say they wish they could do something for Afghans as well as Ukrainians. And so most people who stepped up are worried that we don't have policies that work for all groups, and the group that would only help Ukrainians, it does exist, but it's more at the margins of when 70% support goes to 90% support, rather than something that we have to worry about. So there are opportunities in our national discourses, and I think we can learn from the opportunities, but we also have to reflect that the Polish debate, the British debate, the French debate is very much rooted in the politics and history of that country.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go to Lenka now. So Cindy made the excellent point that there's not one, you know, universal European narrative. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the different narratives we're seeing in Europe about how towards refugees and how Ukrainian situation has shaped those.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, ODI, for inviting me to be part of this very interesting panel today. So as has been said a few times already today, migration has been a salient issue in many European countries for years now. And it has also been quite a divisive issue even at the European level. So there has been quite a lot of conflict between different member states, especially after the so-called migration crisis in 2015. It kind of grew into a European institutional crisis, especially between the new member states and the old member states, when the Visegrad Group countries refused to be part of the resettlement scheme for the refugees from mostly Syria. And this was also reflected in the public opinion of these countries. as we can see here. So for example, these are data from 2018. And at the top, these are the least welcoming countries among EU member states. And we see that the least welcoming country is my own, the Czech Republic. And we followed by Slovakia and Hungary. And we also see Poland quite at the top. So this has been quite a stable thing in the years after 2015, but last year, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen politicians very well known for their anti-migration stance till that day. So, for example, also Matteo Salvini, who was flying to Poland, Viktor Orban, who in March 2022 was saying that all the Ukrainians are welcome to Hungary. So we have seen quite a remarkable shift at the governmental level towards Ukrainian refugees. And not only that, but it seemed that even the publics of these countries, especially in the Visegrad Group countries, have been quite welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, people hosting them in their own homes, people going to the border with their own cars to bring the Ukrainians from Ukraine to their countries, and so on and so forth. So against this backdrop, we at the Migration Policy Center decided to conduct our own survey in 8 European countries, all of the countries bordering Ukraine except Moldova, and also the Czech Republic, which actually at the pro capita has one of the highest number of Ukrainian refugees, and then Germany, Italy, and Austria, which also have quite a large Ukrainian diaspora and already had them, and also very traditional destination countries of migration before the war in Ukraine. And here, these are the first results. When we asked, in our survey, we asked respondents, it was actually in each country, we had around 1,000 respondents on a nationally representative sample of the adult population. So we had around 8,000 respondents in total in these 8 countries. And here we asked them about their opinions, whether they would allow Ukrainian refugees to come and live in their country. We also asked them their opinion about the satisfaction with how the government is handling the Ukrainian situation, and so on and so forth. And as you can see, there's an overwhelming support for Ukrainian refugees in most countries, even in Slovakia, which in this case is the most negative country. Only around 12% of Slovaks would not allow any Ukrainian refugees to come and live in their country, which is quite a low number. On the other hand, we do see that in most of the countries, people would like some sort of control of the numbers, which is reflected in the answers that they would allow a few or some Ukrainians to come. So it's not an overwhelming allow everyone to come in, but especially in the Visegrad Group countries, but there is some need for a certain level of control, but it's quite positive overall. What we also did in our survey is something in social science we call a survey experiment. What this means is that our sample is divided randomly into 2 groups, and each of the 2 groups is asked a slightly different question. And since the respondents are divided really randomly, we are sure that there's no significant difference between the 2 groups. So it's not just women and men, or so it's very random. And in this way, we can actually claim some causal effect because there is no other characteristics that distinguishes the 2 groups between themselves. And our survey experiment one group was asked about Ukrainian refugees specifically, whereas the other group was actually asked about the Syrian refugees specifically. And here are the results. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of difference between the 2 groups, especially in the Visegrad Group countries. So as I was saying previously, only 12% in Slovakia, the most negative country against Ukrainians, would not allow any Ukrainian refugees. It's almost a third of Czechs who would not allow any at all of Syrian refugees. On the other hand, we see that, for example, Germany and Italy do not distinguish as much between the 2 groups as do countries in the Visegrad Group, mostly. So what this means is that there is quite this welcoming attitudes depends. We can say that very much depends on who is the refugee group, actually, especially in the Visegrad group countries. And we also wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So we looked at factors that might affect people's attitudes towards refugees. And for those of you who are not familiar with this type of analysis, this is ordered logistic regression. And what this figure represents is that every factor or everything that is listed that is on the right-hand side of the red line means that it's positively associated with allowing refugees in the country. So for instance, you can tell that people who have higher education would allow more Ukrainian refugees, but you can also, and everything that touches the red line is not statistically significant. So you can also tell that education does not play a role overall in the acceptance of Syrian refugees. And everything that is on the left-hand side from the red line actually means that it's negatively associated. So for some, it might be a little bit surprising, but for example, female respondents are significantly less likely to allow both Ukrainian and Syrian refugees into the country than male respondents. Age does not seem to play any role. As I was saying, education is only significant in the case of the Ukrainian refugees. We also see that people who feel that subjectively they have difficulties with their income are much less likely to want any type of refugees to come into their country, whereas income as an objective measure actually does not play any role. And people who live in big cities are significantly more likely to want refugees to come into their country. And slightly surprisingly, employed people are less likely to want refugees to come. We also were a little bit puzzled from the fact that why is there such a difference between Ukrainian and Syrians, as I was presenting before. And our hypothesis has been that one of the main reasons we see for this differentiation between the two groups is in the Visegrad group countries is the perception of Russian threat. So as you can see here, and the logic again of this figure is the same as was in the previous slide. As you can see from here, so when you consider Russia to be a threat to your country, for instance, in Germany, this leads to you allowing both refugee groups, both Ukrainians and Syrians, to you want them to come to your country, whereas in most of the Visegrad group, this is true only for Ukrainians, and those who perceive Russia as a threat to their country, they would still not allow Syrians to come in. So we interpret this as the kind of a historical legacy. As one of the reasons why Ukrainians have been so welcomed in these countries in the past year, because there is an overwhelming feeling of we have a similar historical experience from the past. There might also be some sort of solidarity in the sense we might be next. Also, the number of passport applications have risen a lot by 200% in most of these countries after the Russian invasion, and so on and so forth. What is a little bit interesting is, for example, Poland, where if you feel Russia is a threat to your country, you would allow significantly more Ukrainian refugees, and you would not allow any Syrian refugees. And how we interpret this is something that Kamila was actually talking about as somehow Russian involvement in the crisis on the Belarusian border. So many respondents might feel that Belarus connected to Russia, this is somehow a Russian responsibility also of this humanitarian crisis that Kamila was talking about. These are the preliminary result of our survey, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the questions as well. So we'll have a microphone here if you want to ask any questions here in the room. And also you can put your questions if you're joining us online in the chat, and they'll be sent out to me. Yes. And please say your name and the organization that you're from.
Hi, Lewis from the FCDO. Yeah, thanks so much for everyone's contribution. It's been really fascinating so far. This has been touched upon slightly, but I wanted to ask you more from the kind of UK angle. When there's negative arguments around migration in the UK, they usually focus on men in small boats, men coming here to take jobs, etc. We all know where they're going with this. Whereas it's kind of common knowledge that the Ukrainian refugees are kind of almost impossible to be young men because of the needs of fighting a war. So I was wondering if there have been any data or studies linking our willingness to accept refugees from Ukraine and our kind of open-armedness to that, to the fact that people also subconsciously are aware that there's very unlikely to be kind of a male-dominated group. Yeah.
Do you want to take your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's quite interesting. We've just seen that gender is a distinction where women are being slightly less supportive in the European study, and the UK data at the moment is the opposite of that, not just on Ukraine, but actually just generally. And there's never really been a gender gap in attitudes to migration. It's much less important than place and geography and politics. Women are more sympathetic, for example, to the men crossing the channel, if it's mostly men, than men are at the moment. And there's complicated things going on there, that women historically in Britain have been more right-leaning than left-leaning, but now are more left-leaning than right-leaning, and women who go out to work and women who get degrees. So there's a complicated thing going on, but at the moment there's more empathy from women for groups that are majority male, as well as for groups that are majority female, than from men. So there's broader politics underpinning that. I think on those narratives, the really important thing to know about the sort of the very polarized debates, we've got a very unifying debate about Ukraine. We've got an incredibly polarizing debate about boat crossings and Rwanda and so on. And the Rwanda scheme was now proposed a year ago, and you can spin it lots of different ways, and you can shift the plurality for it or against it. There's never been a single poll that's found a majority for that scheme, and there's never been a single poll that's found a majority against it either. So it's not as popular as the government would want, and it's not as unpopular as maybe the Archbishop and the Guardian newspaper would want either. And there's a reason for that, because those very polarized debates are making people pick a side, which is, do you want to be on team control, toughness and deterrence, or do you want to be on team compassion and humanity? And about a third of the population offered that choice. So 2/3 actually can pick their side. And we can have a debate between the 2/3 about your language and what you're doing. And a lot of people really dislike that choice, because you're saying, if you want to manage asylum, you've got to be really tough and maybe a bit nasty. And what they're saying is, can't I have control and compassion? So that's what I'd want. And so if government did that, and those narratives that are very, say, racialized or very much about, threat perceptions and so on, they're going to trigger a particular group one quarter, and they're going to repel another quarter, and we're stuck with that. And so I think we've got to work really hard at the sort of control versus compassion. How do you manage it well? How do you build your confidence? And I think that plays a lot, to this broader conversation that's a big theme today, which is, what do we do about these distinctions? If the median citizen in Germany is take many Ukrainians and take some Syrians, and the median citizen everywhere else is take some Ukrainians and take a few Syrians, do we just say you're totally wrong to ever differentiate? Or do we say, okay, you want to take a few and you want to take some, you want to take some, you want to take many, let's show you how that can work. So the answer to the sort of young men issue is to sort of personalize, localize the experience of contact with that group, and whether or not you feel they can contribute to your society.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Maria Grujic, and I'm a postdoc researcher from European University of Viadrina in Germany. But I live in London, that's why I'm here. This was really fascinating, taking to think about the first results of the survey, but as well results of media analysis in Poland through a gender lens, because this so my question is, do we on one hand, we can see that women's political agency is obviously under-researched, because we don't understand enough why women either tend to be more welcoming or to be less welcoming. And on the other hand, we have this very strong vulnerability stereotypes that enforce narratives of welcoming, because through these women and children as ideal refugee perspective. So my question would be how, maybe to all panelists, and you can see who can first pick up on the question, how we can understand better women's political agency in this context, and to overcome this vulnerability stereotype in the analysis of refugee welcoming, because this seems to be somehow one of the pressing questions at the moment, because we just don't understand where this comes from. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen, do you have any thoughts on that? I was really struck by the magazine covers that you showed in your presentation, and the one with the European woman being manhandled. And so I wonder if you had any thoughts about the idea of gender and how this plays into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, I think that's a very striking magazine cover with the headline that translates as along the lines of the Islamic rape of Europe. And, you know, the sort of idea that was very heavily put forward and present in dominant narratives in 2015, sort of under the kind of threat lens of Muslim men being sexually aggressive towards European women, and sort of how that, and that particular headline was sort of drawing on events, I believe in Cologne, and reporting around that, and yeah, and how that sort of then was portrayed in the Polish media really as kind of vindicating the sort of narrative that these sort of sexually aggressive young men from the Middle East were coming to rape or attack Polish women. I think it's a really fascinating question. And I think particularly, what's interesting in Poland is how gender from 2015 really, I think, played into this broader picture that was kind of set up primarily by the Law and Justice Party, but also echoed in sort of, very, prominent mainstream media outlets of the sort of genuine or deserving refugee that was sort of deserving of assistance. And gender was sort of one part of that, but there's sort of lots of, the sort of gendered assumption that that women are vulnerable, and the sort of genuine refugee is vulnerable and needy and visibly poor. So gender was part of that, but also there were sort of lots of pictures of young men at the border in sort of, presentable looking clothing and on smartphones, and sort of how that was all part of this image that was constructed around that time. And I think it's interesting to see how that then played out sort of in the context of refugees from Ukraine. And sort of, as on the one hand, as I sort of mentioned earlier, that there is this stereotype that's been sort of played into, and due to conscription in Ukraine, and due to that, how sort of refugees coming to Poland and elsewhere have predominantly been women, and this sort of idea of really playing on that kind of in government communications and border sort of communications, playing on that vulnerability. But I think it's also interesting how some of those kind of ideas and notion of the sort of genuine deserving refugee have also filtered into the sort of less prominent narratives that exist sort of against Ukrainian refugees. And I think they're, by no means the mainstream, but sort of, I think, reports on social media and people talking about Ukrainians driving fancy cars, or Ukrainians taking up free tickets to Warsaw Zoo, and sort of, having fun and enjoying themselves, and how they kind of fell outside that sort of image that had been constructed since 2015 of the genuine, needy, vulnerable refugee. So I think gender is a really interesting part of that. But I guess my long answer here is that I think it's interesting to also broaden out that lens and look at how that sort of plays into this, why in the context of Poland, but I think it's equally true elsewhere, how that plays into sort of a wider picture of who is or isn't deserving of assistance.
Mm-hmm. I do want to put it to the other panelists, but I just don't want, I'm wary of time, so I just want to make sure we do all the questions.
Can I just add something to?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. So adding something to what Karen said, and the gender thing. So not only the women's political agencies under research, but also men political agency is interesting here. And so one thing is this feminist picture of the refugee, deserving and needy, that is also taking away the agency of this from these people, from these women, especially like saying that you should just sit and suffer, not enjoy yourself in the Warsaw Zoo or elsewhere. So it's just, you know, taking away the agency from the people, and it's very patronizing towards them also. But the other thing is related to masculinity, and also in my research it comes up quite frequently, especially referring to 2015-16 so-called refugee crisis, and this discourse of defending Europe against the Islamic threat and Islamization, as I put it in my first slide. And that's very masculine narrative, very like mobilizing all those masculine ideals of defense, of fighting for the homeland. And that very much links into the Polish national you know, history and narrative about the state, protecting the state's sovereignty, and then protecting Europe against whatever comes. So kind of mobilizing this clash of civilization discourse, reaching out to historical examples, the siege of Vienna, you know, the basically Poland is anti-morale and is protecting Europe against Islamization. It's Christian country, as Europe is Christian also, so it's kind of mobilizing this kind of narratives. And as I said, it's very masculine discourse. It's also very much linked to defense and violence. So we are defending, but against their violence. So that's something important. And in context of migration, especially in Polish migration to the UK, when I did my work on Polish men living in the UK and their perspectives of the, you know, how society that they're living, it was very interesting to note that very many of them were in favor of Brexit, of taking back control against them, because we belong, because we are European, we are white, we are Christian. They do not belong because of reasons. And one of the reasons was that, I'm not sure if you remember, there was a moment that in the public media, there was a lot of discussion about Polish women giving birth in the UK, and the rising birth rates of Polish women in the UK, then in Poland. And there was a discussion, but you know, who is the father of those children? And the fathers are not Polish, the fathers are from other countries and not necessarily white British. So there is this also gender discussion about who is who's entering the interesting relationships. And as it happens, Polish women were more frequently entering interesting relationships than Polish men. And there was also very gender discussion of who owns the women, in inverted commas, of course. And that's also, it was very, very vivid, very fierce discussion on the internet, in the public media, and also very present in my research experience with the men who were feeling that, okay, being abroad, living in England, they actually compete with other men, racialized masculinities of, you know, Muslim men, for Polish women. And that was also quite important in that context, how they felt that their social status is lower, they're less attractive socially as a partner to Polish women, not to mention British women. And so that also played a role here. So that's why I also mentioned about this transnationally mobilized Islamophobia. That was quite that was my observation from the research.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from online. So this is from Katerina Mazzilli from ODI. She thanks all the presenters for their work. And she has a question for Lenka. I was wondering if you could say a bit more on countries that perceive Russia as a threat, still not welcoming Syrian refugees. Is this because they do not perceive Syrians as part of a common past and story, as you mentioned in relation to Ukrainians, or are there other factors as well?
Yes, so our hypothesis is exactly that, because, for instance, at least this is the reason why we do not see the difference in Western European countries such as Germany or Italy. If you perceive Russia as a threat, you would be welcoming both Ukrainians and Syrians, whereas in the Visegrad group, it's not so. And there are a few reasons. One is that although, and this is actually the reason why we picked Syrians, although this has been displayed for a violent conflict, and also where also Russia was involved, that the Russian involvement is not very clear in the sense who is on the wrong side or who is on the right side, whereas with the Ukrainian case, it's very clear. There's the heroes and the victim and the perpetrator and the aggressor. So, this is much clearer in the public discourse of the Visegrad Group countries. And we can see that whereas when you look at the public debates in Italy or in Germany, this has not been such a polarized debate. Also, when when you go to these countries, for instance, in the Czech Republic or Poland, you always see Ukrainian flags on state buildings, whereas in Italy you always see peace flags. You never see Ukrainian flags. So it's a quite different discourse where we are for peace, whereas in these Visegrad Group countries, oh, we are for Ukraine. So this might play also quite a lot of role. And as I was saying, the Russian invasion to Ukraine reminded many people of their own country's historical experience. We have Russian invasion in '68 of the Czechoslovakia. We have Poland and Russia always battling against each other. We have Russia invading Hungary in '56. So these experiences that countries in the West did not have. We see why there is this difference, but we also see that for Syrians in these countries, this would not agree. It's not perceived that Russia actually invaded Syria. So we know there is some involvement, but we don't know on what side Russia is standing. Is it the good one or is it the bad one? And so it's not so dichotomized. And I think this is the reason why people, when they think of Ukrainians, then there's this clear Russian perception, but not with the Syrians.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Can I come in on that as well, just very quickly? Yes. I think that's something that also came out very clearly in our research, and I think there's two very interesting questions there to kind of get to the answer. So I think there's sort of, perhaps it's helpful to separate out. So I think there's the question of why have positive narratives had so much traction when it comes to Ukrainian, and then the sort of separate question of why negative narratives have had so much traction when it comes to other groups. So, for example, Syrians. And I think the answers to both those questions are closely connected, but also I think it's helpful to separate them out. And I think again, in our research, it really came out so strongly, similarly to in Lenka's, about just how much in the context of Poland it matters that it's Russia who's the invader in the context of Ukraine. It just, for many historical reasons, what the cultural memory in Poland and the significance of the fact that it's Russia threatening Ukraine's territorial identity and sovereignty as Poland has experienced in the past and sort of through centuries. But I think in both of those questions, it really does come down to what we know from sort of wider public attitudes research in terms of how attitudes to immigration, refugees intersect with sort of underlying values and worldviews that people have, and very importantly within that, sort of underlying views of cultural insiders and outsiders. And I think in the case of Ukraine, there is just this sort of very strong reason why Ukrainians in countries like Poland, but I think also, as Lenka mentioned, more broadly, sort of tick a lot of boxes in terms of being cultural insiders. And part of that is sort of common history with Russian in the region, and sort of many other factors. For example, in the context of Poland, the sheer number of Ukrainians that were already in Poland before last year, and the level of contact between Poles and Ukrainians. So I think there's these sort of two intertwined questions here, but I think it's very helpful to sort of bring it back to, I think, sort of how that relates to who's perceived as a cultural insider or outsider.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So we're almost out of time. So I'm going to end on a quick fire question to each speaker. I'm going to give you 2 minutes each. So I'm going to be very harsh on the time. But based on the discussions today and your research, what opportunities exist to harness the public and political support for Ukrainian refugees that can then influence the broader narratives to other groups across Europe? So I'm going to start with Karen. 2 minutes. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. So I think in the context of Poland, I think what is helpful, I think, is to really sort of look at where there may be openings in public opinion, sort of broaden that out. I sort of didn't get the chance to in the time we had to cover this earlier, but if we look at sort of polling on the situation on the Poland-Belarus border, you know, I think bringing it back to the point that Sunder made around in the UK around sort of control versus compassion, actually there are elements of that polling that sort of point to a majority of Poles who potentially would favour a compassionate approach. So, for example, one survey found that over 7 in 10 supported access to the border for the media, but also for humanitarian organisations, whereas, as Kamila mentioned, cutting off access for humanitarian organisations was a key part of the government's response. So I think that's something interesting to think about, whether there could be a majority of Poles who might be sort of occupying more of a middle ground, or sort of, you know, in favour of an approach similar to, as Sunder mentioned, in the UK, sort of that would balance control and compassion. So I think trying to really understand that in the context of Poland is important, and then thinking about messages that might connect with those groups. I think there's lots of reasons why positive attitudes towards Ukrainians, you know, why people have been so supportive, lots of reasons behind that, which are very unique and difficult to replicate with other groups. So sort of, you know, thinking about the role of Russia that we've talked a lot about, but I think there is this common thread of the Polish public and their efforts to welcome Ukrainians. So I think in the context of Poland, I think I'd really just come back to base here to explore what that response to Ukrainians means, you know, talking less about refugees, but more about Poles and Polish society, and what that response means for Poland as a sort of welcoming, compassionate nation who were able to mobilize so rapidly and effectively in response to Ukrainians. So yeah, that would be my quick fire answer. I'll pass on to whoever's next.
Kamila, same question to you. What opportunities are there?
Thank you, Karen, for already answering this question partly, but I'm also very pessimistic how we can change this in the sense that there's like two, how to say, I'm trying to think aloud, and I'm not sure if that makes sense. So there are like two parallel developments. On the one hand, Poland mobilized also European public opinion, mobilizing support for Ukrainian refugees, and at the same time, Poland is openly in conflict with European or international humanitarian law, and that also is related to the ongoing conflict of the government with Brussels regarding various issues, judiciary system in Poland, so on and so forth. So those developments are parallel, and very there's a limited chance for discussing the refugee assistance that would actually challenge the government stance on the Belarusian border and people coming through the border, and also public opinion. And I think what we will see coming is actually a very ugly political campaign, because we will have the election this autumn, and that will again probably mobilize the public opinion forward towards supporting the Ukrainian refugees, and then firm stance and against supporting or changing the policy on the Polish-Belarusian border, because yeah, there's this narrative then again that it is Russia who is behind that crisis on the border, and so we cannot actually show our weakness. We show our strength by supporting Ukrainian refugees. We show our strength by stopping people on the border with Belarus. So I'm very pessimistic about possibilities to change this and to influence the public opinion differently. Also because a lot of message that comes from the mainstream media and politicians regarding the Belarusian border, it's difficult to challenge this, right? And difficult to, and there's a huge polarization of the society also regarding these issues, and also lack of awareness about how the humanitarian law works, and how people have right to access the procedure and how this right is taken away from them.
Sorry, I'm just going to stop you there just because I'm mindful of time, but
Sure.
thank you. So there's
Thank you.
Yes,
opportunities.
I'm going to be optimistic in very heated, polarized times. There are big opportunities here in the medium term and the long term, and we could speed them up in the short term too in the crisis response, but we'd have to challenge ourselves in this conversation. If you have a conversation that is sort of liberal in civil society and academia and is basically wanting, great thing, expand the circle of concern, worried about prejudice and exceptionalism and differentiation, we don't really, I think, have a good enough strategy to navigate that, that doesn't involve preaching to the converted, the people who wouldn't want there to be a differentiation, and failing then to think about how that balance the middle is engaged in the conversation about how to widen the circle of concern. And we might sound like we're calling everybody hardline xenophobes when we want to tackle the hardline xenophobes with anti-Muslim, narratives and prejudice being projected, and take that broader middle into where maybe we could broaden the circle of concern. And if you don't get that right, if you don't say what's okay, what should be permitted, so it's definitely okay to have a debate about whether there are challenges in integrating people from Syria into European societies, but you should never stereotype all Muslims just because they're Muslims and have a conversation about them they can't be part of. Then you're talking in the middle, as if you just say anyone who's got a differentiation point might be, going with the fascists, then you're missing the chance to have the conversation about how to get it right. Because the challenge of broadening the circle of concern is to talk about how do people become us, and how do we broaden more confidence that more people can become us. People, when my dad arrived in this country, didn't think that people like me could be us. People don't doubt that anymore, but a newer group, they might have the doubt. What speeds it up? Meaningful contact at scale, at pace, in a broader range of geographies. How would you speed that up? You'd institutionalize public contact, civic contact in welcoming, and try to have the people doing it, not just being all of the people who are on our marches as well, but some of the people who don't come on our marches because they're, training football matches or something on a Saturday morning, having a root in the active welcoming across groups. So institutionalized welcoming with a broad geography, open schemes for all groups, and have a practical navigation of what are prejudices and what are preferences, and work with the people who've got preferences but might still do a lot for one group and something for other groups as well.
Okay, last but not least, Lenka.
Yes, so although I actually do agree with Karen and Kamila that I think the Ukrainian situation is very specific, and in particular, I'm going to give it a little bit of more optimistic spin, or I try at least. Social science research has shown again and again that is the reason for anti-immigration or anti-refugees attitudes is the perception of threat, whether actual or perceived, it doesn't matter. And this has been again a little bit shown with the Ukrainian refugee crisis, at least in the Visegrad group countries, because all the reasons for feeling threat against them are mostly not present. So it's actually a genuine need to come. So it cannot be spin off as these are coming to steal our jobs and so on and so forth. As we discussed today, it's mostly women and children. So people do not feel threatened by these young men coming here to, as we discussed today, steal our women or rape our women and so on and so forth. And also people were already mostly familiar with Ukrainians because they were the largest majorities in these countries even before the war. So what this all shows is that there is actually hope. So the reasons why they might be so negative against, for instance, Syrians is actually because they feel threatened because of the unknown. They do not have, at least in these countries, much more experience with people coming from these countries with a different religion, looking differently and so on. I mean, we cannot forget that these countries were closed for 40 years under communism. So of course, there was not that many opportunities as there were in the UK to meet new cultures and of course, blend the societies much more multicultural. So in this sense, there is hope, because in the case that people actually can familiarize themselves with also other types of refugees or other people, the perception of threat should probably go lower, and then these attitudes might finally change.
Thank you so much. So we're right at time. We're going to wrap up here. I want to thank all of the panelists for the discussion today. Karen, Kamila, Sunder, Lenka, I think everyone can agree it's very fascinating. A recording of this event will be available on the ODI websites within the next couple of days. And thank you all for joining us here in person and online. Have a great day.
Thank you very